Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome to another AIP tutorial. Today we're going to be taking a look at how we can take a simple title sequence and kind of make it a lot more visually pleasing and interesting. There's not really much to this title sequence, but it looks pretty cool. Alright, so let's get started. Alright, so in this sequence we have what appears at first to be a light, and we have this darkness on each side. And as we go along, that darkness encroaches more and more into the light, shrinking it further away. Perfect for a little horror scenario, right? To make things feel even more claustrophobic, we have the text here, which is squishing in with the light. But it turns out that light is actually the title. Let's get started on building this thing. Alright, to get this party started, let's create a new composition by going over here to this little fella and clicking on it. Alright, so we're going to call this main comp, and we're going to make this 1920 by 817. Frame rate is going to be 23.976. Duration, we're going to set to about 15 seconds. Alright, so now we can hit OK. Alright, so first thing we're going to do is create our main title, The Scary Thing. So we can right click down in this empty space right here, go to New, Text, and let's type in the... Alright, so before we do that, let's switch this to something that we can actually see. Alright, so if we click on the layer, go down to Character, let's set this to 50% gray. Alright, now we can double click on the layer again, and now we can get to typing The Scary Thing. All right, so let's set this up. We want to make this bigger. Maybe something like this, maybe 257. So let's go into our line and just align this in the center. Now, real quickly, I want to go over this. We're using Shackleton. That's actually available on the Adobe Fonts page. So even if you just click on right here, you can go right there and you can get Shackleton condensed. Also, an important thing to note that under paragraph, we have this set to center text. So that's another thing you're going to want to make sure that you have going on. All right, so when I'm working with a text layer, I like to precompose that. So let's hit Shift-Command-C, and we're going to call this Text PC for precomposition. And we're going to hit OK. All right, so let's start with the basic animation, and that is of this title being zoomed out slowly and then zooming in really quickly. All right, so to do this, let's go to 8 seconds. This is when our animation is going to be completely done. And let's hit S on the keyboard to bring up the scale, and let's add a keyframe. So now let's go to 7 seconds in, right? And let's start zooming this in. Now we're going to make it go just past this line right here in the A. Maybe just a little bit more. There we go. All right, so now you'll notice that it looks really bad. The edge of the A is all pixelated. Now this is what happens when you zoom something in at 3000%. It just becomes a mess of blobby pixels. Now the thing is, text layers are not rasterized, which means you can scale them to any size and they will still be crisp and clean. But we need to transfer that over from our original text onto our text PC. And that's a really easy and simple trick. See this thing right here? We've used it before. Collapse transformations, or for vector layer, continuously rasterize. So let's turn that on. Boom, problem solved instantaneously. So now we have our basic zoom out. So let's go all the way to the beginning here, and let's zoom this in even further. Now we can hold down Shift while we're doing this, and that will help it move a lot quicker. So let's bring it to maybe about there, maybe about 5000%. So it's going to slowly zoom out, and then all of a sudden it's going to zoom out really quickly to reveal our title. So let's take these two keyframes, and we want to add Easy Ease, but we want to do it like this. Right click on the first one, go to Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease Out, because this is going to be easing out from this position. Now we can go to the last keyframe, Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease In, and this will ease it into its final position. Now another thing, you'll notice that our rectangle here isn't completely centered, and I want that. So let's go to 8 seconds, where our animation is done. Let's hit Shift P to bring up the position, and let's create a keyframe at 8 seconds. Let's go to the beginning, Now let's just move this over in the x-axis till it's about right in the center. There we go, just like that. Now let's take this keyframe and move it all the way to 7 seconds. Now we can hit Shift and that'll snap it to this keyframe right here, which is what we want. Now let's take our first keyframe, right click, Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease Out, last keyframe, Easy Ease In. So that way it'll just match the zoom. Now I'm putting this movement in between this fast zoom just so you don't really notice what's happening while it's happening. It's just kind of hiding our crimes, if you will. All right, so now what I want to do is pre-compose this text PC. Shift-Command-C, that'll pre-compose it, and we'll just call this text comp. There we go. And we're going to make sure move all attributes into new composition is marked off here, and we're going to hit OK. Now let's bring in our text friends. So this is a pretty simple process, but we're going to make it a little more complicated, but actually easier in long run by doing the last text first. So in total, we're going to have this say, prepare yourself for the scariest thing you will ever see. So what we want to start out with is the second part of that, for the scariest thing you will ever see. So let's create a new text layer. And before we do this, let's change the color once again to be completely black. So that way we can see what we're doing here. And preemptively, I'm going to shrink the text size down. We'll do 122 for now. So now let's double click on our text layer so we can just start typing. And we're going to type in for the scariest thing. And let's just kind of align that to the center. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to set up the animation for this and then create all the other text layers. So that way we only have to work on the animation for one layer and then duplicate it and work from there. Makes things a lot easier. Now for the animation, as far as squishing the letters, that's pretty simple to do. So let's twirl open our text layer, and right away we have this animate option. So let's click on that little triangle thingy and go to tracking. Now this is going to be the space in between each character. So let's select this. And what we can do is we can make this move in and out. All right, so let's set this to 0 for now and go to 7 seconds. Now, right away, we want to make sure that the size of the font is good for what we're trying to do. So we want to fit it inside of this rectangle, this gray rhombus, rather. We're going to go to character and we're going to set this up. We're going to change the font size, make it a little bit smaller. Let's align this to the center. And I actually want to shift this over a little bit so it's more in the center of this guy. All right, so as I said, we're going to be animating this track amount. So let's go to the first frame when the rhombus is at its thickest, and let's bring that over. Now we want to try and keep about the same amount of spacing between this edge and this F, and obviously the G and this edge, as it was when we first started here. So if we turn off our animator, we can see that there's, a pretty decent amount of space. So let's go to the first frame. Let's turn our animator back on, and we can actually bring this up a little bit more. We'll do 27. How about that? We can always go back and change it if we need to. All right, so what we're going to do is open up our range selector, and we're going to actually animate the offset rather than animating this tracking amount. 0% is fully extended, if you will, and 100 will be its default position. So let's set this to 0. Create a keyframe at the first frame, then go to 7 seconds, and let's set this to 100. Now, one thing you'll notice is that it's doing one letter at a time, and it kind of looked cool, but I don't really want that. So what we can do is go into Advanced, open that up, and we have Based On, and right now it's set to Characters. And then we can also do characters excluding spaces, but what we want is lines. So that way it'll squish the entire line at the same time. There we go. That's exactly what we want. Now that's the animation as far as the tracking goes. So what we can do is actually duplicate this layer. Let's turn off the bottom one and let's type in "you will ever see ... All right, so now let's duplicate that again, Command D, and let's turn off the original "you will see." Now let's double click on this one and type in "prepare yourself ... So now if we turn all of these on, you'll see that we have all three text layers are moving at the same pace. Now, this is obviously not what we want. We don't want this jumble of whatever this is, right? So we're actually going to have each one fade in over time. Now let's take our prepare yourself and move that to the bottom, since that's going to be the first one to show up. So we'll animate from the bottom up. All right, and before we do that, let's take You Will Ever See text layer, and let's start bringing it down while holding Shift, and that will bring it down on one axis. And let's just put some spacing in between those two lines. You can use your arrow keys to move it around if you want. All right, so now let's take both our For the Scariest Thing and You Will Ever See, and let's move that up till it's in line with our Prepare Yourself. All right, we're getting closer to what we want. All right, so let's turn off our top two text layers and leave Prepare Yourself on. Let's hit T on the keyboard to bring up the opacity. Let's set it to 0 and then create a keyframe. Now let's go to maybe 3/4 of a second in, and we're going to switch this to 100. So that way we have it fading in. So let's take both of our keyframes, hit Command C to copy them. All right, so we want both. We'll count both of these as one line. So we want both lines, the Prepare Yourself and then the rest, to happen within these first 7 seconds. So if we do the math real quick, we have 2 lines that need to happen in between 7 seconds. So that would be 3.5 seconds would be the halfway point. So let's paste those keyframes on, and let's move this over. So the last keyframe happens at 3 seconds and 12 frames, 3.5 seconds. But these aren't working the way we want. We want it to go from 0 to 100 and then 100 to 0. This is going from 0 to 100, back to 0, then back to 100. So if we take these 2 last keyframes, right click, go to Keyframe Assistant, Time Reverse Keyframes. Simple as that. And let's take all of our keyframes. Let's copy them, Command C, and let's go to 3.5 seconds. And we're going to select both of our top text layers and just hit Command V to paste those in. And we're just going to hit T to bring up the opacity. And here we go. They're in there. But first, we need to actually turn them on to see what we're doing, right? Probably. That's probably the best solution. All right, so now we have our text. But I still want to bring it a little bit further. I want it to actually blur as it goes out. So let's go to our Prepare Yourself, and let's add a Fastbox Blur. And that is going to be under Blur and Sharpen Fastbox Blur. Now let's add that onto Prepare Yourself. And let's set the blur radius to, let's say 35. That's a good number. All right, so now let's go to the first frame, create a keyframe for our blur radius. Now we can hit U to bring up those keyframes again. When our text layer is completely visible, we can set that to 0. Then we just take these 2 keyframes, copy them, paste them, and then do the reverse keyframes. There we go. Perfect. Now let's take all 4 keyframes, copy them. Actually, what we're going to do is select our Fastbox Blur up in here, Command C to copy that, and let's just select our other 2 text layers and hit Command V at 3.5 seconds. And that'll automatically add our Fastbox Blur plus the keyframes. All right, so we're pretty much finished with the animation part. Now let's make this look more aesthetically pleasing. First step to accomplishing this is we're going to use a technique that we actually used in the many uses of Fastbox Blur. So we're going to take our main title here. Let's go to when it's fully zoomed out. And what we're going to do is we're just going to duplicate our text comp, Command D, and we're going to turn off that top layer. So now we're going to add a Fastbox Blur to our bottom layer. And for now, we're going to set this to about 10. So now our text is blurry. Cool. All right. So now we're going to toggle switches and modes until we get to our track matte information. And we're going to set the track matte to read from the alpha matte of the layer above it. And this will create a nice little light panel look. And of course, we can go in and just readjust this to how we want it to look. I think for now, I'm going to do 9 for the blur radius. All right, that was step 1. So now let's click on the very top layer and create a new adjustment layer. And we're going to add a glow, and that is under Stylize Glow. Let's add that onto our adjustment layer. And we're going to do this real quickly because we've done the exact same thing on a couple different tutorials now, except with a little bit of different settings. All right, so let's go to Glow Threshold. Let's put that all the way down to 0. Then go to Glow Radius. Let's set that to 20. And then for Glow Intensity, let's put that at 0.1. Now it doesn't look like we did much, but here we are. We're going to duplicate our glow. And for the second one, under Glow Radius, we're going to set that to 3 times the amount, which is 60. Then we're going to duplicate it one more time, and we're going to set that final Glow Radius to 180, 3 times 60. All right, so now we have our glow. Let's actually close these up because we're not going to use them anymore. Now we want to colorize this thing. Now, I like to keep it simple and not use any third-party plugins unless it's something that I use all the time and it's completely free. And that is VC Color Vibrance. Now this is Video Copilot's Color Vibrance. If you haven't heard of Video Copilot, I'm immensely confused by that. All right, so we have VC Color Vibrance. And of course you can download this plugin at videocopilot.net. And we're just gonna change the color to, let's say, an orange, maybe a little bit more orangey. There we go, something like that. So now when we're doing glows and stuff like that, we need to actually create a black solid background. So let's do that. New, solid, black solid, and we can name this BG for background if we want. And then we can hit Shift Command, open bracket, and that'll bring that all the way down to the bottom. Just real quick to show you the difference. So now we have our glows and our coloring. Now another thing I want to do is do a little bit of flickering. So we can go down to our text comp. Let's hit T on the keyboard to bring up the opacity. And we're going to Alt click on the stopwatch. And we're going to put in a simple but very useful expression called wiggle. So we're going to type in wiggle, open parentheses, and we're going to include 2 numbers separated by a comma. The first number being the frequency and the second number being the value. So what this is going to do is it's going to pick a random value between whatever parameter you set, and it's going to do that however many times a second that you put. So we'll do 10 seconds or 10 times a second, comma, and for demonstration purposes, we're going to do a value of 20. So what this means is, I mean, obviously you can't have an opacity above 100%. So you can't have 120% opacity. So what this is actually going to do is go from 80 to 100 randomly 10 times a second. All right, so we can click out of this expression and let's real quickly preview this. All right, so you can see that we have our flicker. Now that the demonstration is over, let's set this to something a little more subtle. I'm just going to set this to 5. All right, so you might notice a little something happening right here is that we have this dark edge on the border here at the top. We don't want that. What that is, if we go into our Fastbox Blur, we just check off our repeat edge pixels and that'll solve that problem for us. Another thing we might notice here is if we go to the end of this animation, you'll see just how far this darker orange reaches out into the center before turning into this lighter orange. Now, if we go to when it's zoomed in, that is significantly different. We want to bring that dark orange in more towards the center. So let's go to 8 seconds when the animation is finished. Let's go to our bottom text comp. Actually, let's do this. Text matte, and this will just be title. Actually, let's go back in here. Title matte. There we go. So we have our title and our title matte. So we can go to our title layer and go to our blur radius at 8 seconds. And let's click on the stopwatch. And again, let's hit U on the keyboard to bring up that keyframe. Now let's go to 7 seconds and let's bump that up. There we go. About 206 should do. So this way we have more of that dark orange border, more of a gradient into our brighter spot. And it pretty much matches up with when it's fully zoomed out. Now, what we can do is take these keyframes and do the easy ease out and ease in. It's not really necessary, but we'll just add it for consistency. All right, so one of the last things I want to do is make this look more organic. The way we can do that is adding motion blur to our text as it zooms out. So let's go into our title, and we have our text PC, which has our movement on it. And we want to actually toggle switches and modes until we get to our motion blur. Now, we can't turn on motion blur from here because it's being read from the original text composition, our text PC. So what we actually have to do is go into our text PC and turn on motion blur for this layer. Now this doesn't move, so it really shouldn't have any motion blur. But if we go to our text comp, and then what we actually need to do is turn on motion blur, now we have our motion blur. Now if you want to change the settings, we can go up to composition settings, go to advanced, and here under motion blur, we can set the shutter angle. The higher the number, the larger your motion blur will be. And if we go back, samples per frame and adaptive sampling limit, those are quality. The higher the number, the higher the quality. But we also want to set this to 90 degrees for the shutter angle. All right, now we can hit OK. So now if we go into our main comp, we have our motion blur all set up. Now, one thing I want to change here is this text. I want it to make it seem more like it's part of the rectangle rather than text being over top. And one way I kind of figured out how to do that is go into our Fastbox Blur on our little text layers here. Prepare yourself. And let's hit U to bring up the keyframes. So let's go to the end of this initial animation of it coming on. And let's select that keyframe plus the keyframe before it starts fading out. And let's just type in 1. And making sure that your playhead is right on one of these two keyframes. Now that'll add just a little bit of blur, but it will actually kind of make it seem like it's part of the rectangle a little bit more. All right, so now what we can do is select these two keyframes right here, Command C to copy it, and then go into our other text layers, hit U to bring up the keyframes, and from there we can just paste. Simple. Now for the last thing for our look, we're going to add film grain. Now I'm going to use, I can't give you this obviously in the project files, but you'll have to download it yourself. What I'm using is Gorilla Grain's free plugin, and unfortunately it is only 720p. So if we take that and add that onto our composition, we can right click, go to transform, fit to comp with, and that'll automatically size it. Now what I like about this is it actually has dust and scratches and hairs and stuff that just appear. And it looks very natural because it's a film, it's an actual film scan. All right, to get this to work, we need to set this to overlay. And now we have our grain. But I want the grain to be really in your face. So what I'm going to do is set this back to normal. And I'm just going to duplicate this layer, set the top one to overlay. So that way we have like a doubling up of our grain. Then we can just take both of these layers, Shift Command C to precompose them. We'll call this grain and hit OK. So now we can set this layer to overlay. And now our grain is just right there in your face. Now, one thing grain does is it gives your digital art a little more organic feel. But what it also does, it kind of brings all the effects and everything together into one cohesive visual masterpiece, if you will. Now, if you notice, it doesn't go all the way to the end here. So what we can just do is duplicate it and just move that over. And we can hold down Shift and that will snap it to the end of this composition. So there we go. Now, one last thing we want to do is have the text fade out. So at about maybe 11 seconds. All right, so let's hit T on the keyboard. Even though we created an expression on here, we can actually create another keyframe. So let's create a keyframe at 11 seconds. All right, now let's go to 14 seconds and set this to 0. All right, so let's play this back. I like how it fades out. But oh no, the wiggle is still going and it's causing our layer to be visible when we don't want it to be. Now we can actually fix this really easily. So let's add another effect on here, the slider control, and that's under expression control, slider control. Now we actually did a little bit of coverage on this on our last tutorial about expressions. So let's add this to our title. And what we're going to do is we're going to change this to wiggle AMT, amount. So now all we need to do is open this up, go to our expression, and under our value, let's highlight our value here of 5, and let's just pick whip it to the slider of our wiggle amount. Now, if we get out of this, we're going to have an issue. And this actually tells you what's happening. So what this is saying right here, it's telling you what it needs. It's expecting to close the parentheses that we made here. So we actually need to just hit OK. So we actually need to go back and actually add another close parentheses at the end, and that'll solve that issue. So now we're not going to have any wiggle at all. So let's go to this last keyframe and let's create a keyframe on our slider and set that to 0. Now let's go like, I don't know, let's say a couple frames in and set that to 5 again. So that way we will have our value of 5 and then it will go to 0. So that way our title will remain invisible for as long as we want it. Now all this is pretty render intensive, so let's take all of these layers, Shift Command C, and just precompose them. We'll call it whatever. Precomp 4 is fine. So After Effects likes when it just has to read from one layer rather than all of these layers. All right, so that's our little animation all finished up, looking nice and nice. I like the way it fades out because of the wiggle. It's kind of like that, like dying light kind of thing. All right, that's it for this episode. If you learned something, found that helpful, just, hey, don't be afraid to hit the like button or the subscribe button. It's okay. I won't judge you. But if you don't, I will judge you. All right, well, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.